gave us the thumbs up.
Okay.
Hello everyone, welcome to the human trafficking presentation. I would like to introduce Brandon Keel, Detective Keel, and Detective Wieland. Just a couple of things to cover. If you guys need to use the restroom, they're out the door to the left. Otherwise, for those of you who are on GoToMeeting, enter your questions into the chat and there will be questions and answers after the presentation. Otherwise, I think we can get started.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for choosing to share your evening with us, whether it's in person or virtually. This will be a fun adventure for us to be able to have two different audiences. So we'll kind of get through it. A little bit of background on Scott and I. So I work for the City of Sheboygan Police Department. I do all the sex trafficking investigations that take place within the City of Sheboygan. And Scott works for the Sheriff's Department, and he does the sex trafficking investigations through the Sheriff's Department for the county. So we work together very frequently, and we're also part of the Sheboygan County Human Trafficking Task Force. We're representing them tonight. This is the community presentation that we put together to make sure that everyone within the community is getting the same information, because I think it's really important. There's a lot of misconceptions about human trafficking. What's portrayed in movies and on television shows often is very inaccurate. So hopefully we can give you some relevant information so that way the community is aware of how this is impacting Sheboygan.
So we'll get going with the presentation, in that our team with the Human Trafficking Task Force for Sheboygan County is a multidisciplinary team. It's composed of a number of different disciplines such as Child Protective Services, the hospitals, probation, parole, obviously law enforcement, Child Advocacy Center, which is a group that we utilize for child forensic interviews. And we collaboratively work together, monthly meetings, sometimes more monthly depending on our workload. And we've been very productive in bringing about awareness and prevention in our community. So these are some of the individuals within our team.
You can see on the screen that we have a bunch of different stakeholders that are involved with representing their organizations and working together on how we can minimize the impact human trafficking is having on Sheboygan County. I think for us, this is what makes a huge difference in the work that we can do, and not only the prevention but the awareness piece. Is we have all these different enthusiastic and motivated people that work together really effectively, and that allows us to share information, share ideas. When we do have a case that involves a victim, there's a bunch of people that we can organize a treatment plan and what kind of resources that we can surround to help someone get better. So that's a really good thing that we have going for us.
So the state of Wisconsin has a statute that covers human trafficking. And I'm just going to read it. It's recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining of an individual for a commercial sex act or labor. I would include force, fraud, and coercion. Those are the main elements that traffickers use to manipulate the victim. And when I say victim, we kind of use that term interchangeably with survivor. Okay, a victim of human trafficking, somebody that's still in what we call or refer to as in the life of human trafficking. And when they're a survivor, that's something where they're able to get out of the life of human trafficking, if you will. They're able to survive that element and, get away from the trafficker and go towards a road of healing and betterment for themselves.
So a lot of people beg the question, why does this happen and how does it happen? And a lot of people are familiar with the common perception of a domestic violence relationship, where there's a lot of power and control that takes place. This kind of outlines the means of control. So if you look at the conventional things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, those are the obvious things that kind of create that lane for a victim to stay in. But it goes a little bit larger than that with the manipulation that's done. The trafficker implements a lot of coercion, a lot of blaming. It's a really confusing place for a victim to find themselves in. And what's really complicated is because they're having a difficult time self-identifying and understanding this themselves, they become a little bit caught up in, well, how can somebody else understand this if I don't understand it myself? And that's a lot of times why there's fear of talking to the police or sharing their story with a trusted adult, because they're having a difficult time understanding this whole thing themselves.
So a number of spectrums come within the human trafficking continuum, if you will. One of the things that I always look at is, the idea that there's this hole in our soul that we all need to have fulfilled, love, attention, a sense of belonging. And the traffickers know that, and they know the vulnerabilities, and they seek out ways to take on those vulnerabilities and take advantage of them, manipulate. And so they do that in a number of ways, which we'll go through as we continue on through the presentation.
And this slide kind of outlines some of the scenarios that we find. So on the bottom, you see an adult who chooses to sell sex for various reasons. It may start that way, and that's unfortunately kind of the gateway of how trafficking victimization can kind of take place. And then you can see that next slide where, that person might keep some of their profits, but obviously has to share it with a pimp or a trafficker, otherwise they're abused. So it can escalate very quickly depending upon the situation they find themselves in.
And keep in mind with that as well, they can be in different positions throughout their lifetime. At one moment they can be working for a trafficker, another moment they can be just working for themselves and then back with a trafficker.
And that really brings us to this next slide that encompasses this point really easily, is that the relapse rate is a really complicated thing for us to interact with, because victims find themselves in this situation often. The trauma and some of the impact that this has had on their life, they find themselves in these situations kind of over and over again. And it's also difficult to kind of get them treatment and support because they've been kind of trained and brainwashed to not trust adults. People who are advocates, people who are law enforcement, people who are involved in the court system, they've been told, they've been trained not to trust those individuals. So that's one of the reasons why that relapse rate is higher. From time to time, we do see branding or tattoos, so you might have a specific tattoo or mark that might be affiliated with the trafficker. Sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't. Another part that makes our cases unique, though, again, is that fear of prosecution. Unfortunately, victims are often involved in criminal activity. They might be involved with distribution of drugs, retail theft, robbery, other things like that. So as a result of those things kind of being a part of the lifestyle that they're in, there is a fear that they're going to be held accountable for that by going through the court system and catching cases. So that's just one of those complicated things that it does make trafficking a little bit unique compared to other crimes that we investigate.
So this is a heat map of the United States showing the areas of human trafficking. And this is derived from the human trafficking hotline. As they obtain phone calls, they developed this map through data. If you can imagine, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just people that are fed up with being trafficked, typically, or fed up with being a victim, or maybe somebody did see something and they decided to say something. You will notice our area, the Midwest, is pretty red and pretty orange. So this is an area that is of great concern as well. One of the reasons for that is we're just too nice. The Midwest, I think we're too nice. We have a difficult time saying no to strangers, right? I mean, our kids will say no to us anytime, but they won't say no to a stranger. Whereas the East Coast and West Coast, they typically don't have that, those issues, if you will. That, and there is a gentleman by the name of Ken Ivey. He put together some books, 48 Laws of the Game, basically teaching others how to be traffickers. And he's based out of Milwaukee. He lives in Milwaukee today. So traffickers come from all over, in theory, to learn the game of being a trafficker. I call it a pimp turnship, because pimp is the slang term for trafficker that's been used over the years.
We do hear often, why is trafficking so bad in Sheboygan? And here's what I want to say to that, and I think it's important that we all realize this. Sheboygan is no different than any other community. It's impacting Sheboygan just like it's impacting every corner of our nation. The difference is that we have a bunch of professionals that prioritize minimizing the impact that this has in our community. So the group of people that we talked about earlier, all these different representatives that prioritize this and work together on how we have an impact, I think it's part of our community to just actually talk about this, that it's impacting it, what we can do to disrupt it. That's what sets us apart. There are other communities that are actually very far behind in what they're doing with prevention and awareness. And I'm very happy that we just have a really, preventative aspect, a lot of people working together where we're trying to disrupt the impact this is having on our community.
So this is the image a lot of people get when it comes to human trafficking victims. I don't know about you, Brandon, but I've never seen that to be the case. They're not in chains, they're not in bondage, so to speak. In theory, you would think they could just walk away and they'd be free to go. The problem is, where do they go? They feel as though, there's this shame, this guilt that's taken place because they got in the life of human trafficking and there's no place to go. They're traffickers, they're everything. It could be their supplier of drugs, it could be their supplier of shelter or food, money, you name it. And the trafficker knows this, and then they work off of that. So yeah, in a lot of ways they're trapped and they're afraid to go to law enforcement for help.
The image that you see on the screen, it frustrates us because of the way human trafficking is showcased in movies and television shows. It has a difficult impact on someone who is actually a victim and self-identifying, because they're not locked in a cage, they're not being driven around in the suspicious white van. Those things aren't happening. They do have some freedom of movement where they might be allowed to go to school or maintain a job or live at home with mom and dad. So it is a complicated, difficult thing for a legitimate victim to understand. If they watch the movie Taken, it's not happening that same way. And it also has those perceptions of what the impact it has on society too, where we see something and maybe it doesn't seem right, but it doesn't look like the movie Taken. So that's just a difficult thing for us to kind of navigate.
And to kind of, go along with that, there's a number of myths that go along with human trafficking. The idea that it's always a violent crime. Sure, that is a component and can be a component. We oftentimes refer to them as guerrilla pimps. They're the ones that, cause the force and the physical interaction with the victims. But oftentimes it's just not true. It's just not the case. There's something referred to as a Romeo pimp, somebody that wines and dines their victim, almost like a boyfriend would. And it can be a combination of the two. It can be a Romeo pimp that turns into a guerrilla pimp.
Yeah, the violence that you'd portray in your head as being this frequent, often thing, it's a confusing place for a victim, because there's young people that I've interviewed that are legit victims that have said that there were times that it wasn't a bad situation. We went to Dave & Buster's, we had we went out to dinner. There weren't bad situations until all of a sudden there was a rule violated, and then that's when there was violence. The next point with the physically unable to leave, we've kind of talked about that already, but it's very rare, and I haven't seen cases like that, at least so far in Sheboygan, where somebody's being locked in a cage or a van or anything like that. There is generally some freedom of movement, but that manipulation that we've already kind of highlighted is so significant that it's essentially like being locked in an invisible cage.
The idea that victims never know they're traffickers isn't true either. I mean, it's oftentimes the opposite, right? Any type of violence, crime against a person is usually somebody they know. Oftentimes, it can be familial trafficker, meaning it can be a family member that's actually pushing for the trafficking. Maybe they mean well. Maybe they think there's nothing better for their son or daughter to do in the world other than to take over where they left off as being trafficked themselves. It can be a cycle in that regard.
When traffickers are looking at potential victims to target, a lot of it is kind of like an investment. They're assessing, how successful will I be if I try to, target this specific person. So they're looking at those vulnerabilities. They want to build that relationship. It might take 6 months to a year before that takes place. There's a significant, stake placed in building a relationship, building trust, giving promises, showering them with gifts. That does take time. So it might not happen until that person is one of the closest people to that victim.
And the idea of, only women and girls are trafficked, again, not necessarily true as well. We do refer to them in our presentations oftentimes as girls, as being the victims, but not necessary. It can be boys, it can be men. There's no socioeconomic boundaries when it comes to human trafficking. And same thing with the trafficker. Trafficker can be any type of skin color or gender, if you will.
Yeah, there's really nothing that discriminates with victimization or what traffickers look like. They can look like regular people that you see at the gas station, at the park, walking down the street. They can come from different ages, different ethnicities, different genders, like you see on the screen. And it's the same thing with traffickers. It's, you might have somebody who's older, you might have somebody that's younger. It could be a woman, it could be a man. And again, some of those points, they're looking for specific people to target, people that have those vulnerabilities, which we'll get into in a little bit. They're not targeting the random people. And again, they're building that trust. What we see often is sometimes they use a victim for recruitment because it's a little easier to isolate yourself from the investigation or prosecution if you're using other people for the recruitment. So we do see that from time to time.
Disguises. So I kind of touched on this already regarding the boyfriend being the trafficker. This can be somebody who can be a friend or even a parent, as I mentioned earlier. As well, the provider, someone who provides for those basic needs of the victim. And oftentimes we do find that there is a drug connection, whether it be they're addicted to drugs leading up to being trafficked, or once they're being trafficked, there's that component of being addicted to a drug. And the trafficker utilizes that to control the victim as well by either withholding or providing the drug so that, they're out of their state of mind, so to speak, and when dealing with the trafficking.
That's probably the biggest attribute that we see is there's an addiction component just because it becomes such a powerful thing. We've seen the heroin epidemic and the meth epidemic really impact our country, and addiction is such a strong thing that it's not a surprise that they're using that to their advantage.
So it refers to the protector. This can be somebody that knows of a girl who ends up, it could be a guy as well, being trafficked, and they didn't have a trafficker in place. Sometimes a trafficker moves in and, acts as though they're the protector to take care of them and protect them from other traffickers, if you will. Victims can be seen just like any other property where traffickers exchange victims amongst themselves, and there's a certain dollar amount that goes along with that.
That promiser piece, we see that very often. And it's generally how this kind of starts is that promise of wealth, that promise of a better life. A lot of the victims that we interact with are on hard times. They have issues with poverty, homelessness, not having food, having some legal troubles, needing resources. So that promise of like, hey, I'm going to help you make $2,000 in one night. If you have somebody that's down on their luck, that's going to seem like a pretty enticing, good opportunity if they're really desperate. So we see that very, very often, and that's really the main piece, I think, that manipulates a lot of people falling into this lifestyle.
One of the things I've done during presentations for the schools is talked about, hey, if your boyfriend or your girlfriend talks about being a record producer or a professional photographer and they're trying to entice you into being modeling, those are just red flags. Run for the hills, so to speak, because they probably have some other intent for you to be victimized. The punisher, again, that's just the guerrilla pimp that I mentioned earlier, somebody that uses the force to control their victim through violence and intimidation.
And these 5 things can kind of interchange. You might have one trafficker that exhibits all 5 of these. It's very interchangeable. So that manipulation process, and I think this is the really important piece for people to understand, because conventional wisdom, you hear about somebody stuck in this really difficult situation and you think to yourself, well, I don't have to just walk away. Why can't they just ask for help? And this victim selection and kind of what goes into how it takes place is really powerful. So again, what makes the child, adult vulnerable? And for each victim, that might be different. They might have multiple different vulnerabilities, or they might just have a couple. And how does the person gain access to the child? We live in the world of social media, right? I did a presentation today actually at one of our middle schools in Sheboygan. I had every student raise their hand that had a social media account that they use. Almost every single kid raised their hand. Now the question I want to ask you, how many of you have contact with someone online that you don't know personally? The same hands went up. So it kind of goes to show you that kids are dealing with technology. They spent an entire year glued to the screen during the pandemic. They're growing up with this, and they don't have the best judgment to make good decisions on who they're interacting with. Well, traffickers are definitely using that to their advantage. So that access piece, that has been a game changer over the last couple of years. And then what has this person provided to build that trust? Especially our children, right? They're looking for the new iPhone, the new shoes. They're very materialistic. Traffickers are really good at manipulating those processes. So that's really how that process can be really, really effective.
And one of the bigger vulnerabilities is love, as I mentioned earlier. Everybody wants to be loved, and they're seeking out love, and these traffickers promise that oftentimes as the means of being a boyfriend, and somewhere down the line, they throw in, well, we need to earn some money so we can keep this apartment, or we need to earn some money so that we can travel out west, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's how they get the victim on board, that this idea that someday they'll have a family, and it'll be a normal life, but right now this is what we need to do.
And I think if you look at these vulnerabilities, the victims that Scott and I have interacted with, they may exhibit one of these or they may exhibit all of these. And you notice that some of the circles are blank. There might be vulnerabilities that are specific to just that person that maybe that trafficker is aware of and they're using that to manipulate. So, you look at these circles, everyone in this room can probably identify one person in their life that has some of these. And that's why it's really important for us to have dialogue about this and have awareness to make sure that people are safe and making good decisions, especially if they fall within this category. And that exploitation of vulnerabilities, you look on the left side, somebody might have a history of abuse. Our runaway population is one of the greatest risks in our community because they're running away from something. They might have home life issues, school issues, mental health issues, so there's that piece. The economic struggle, trying to make ends meet is a complicated thing, and then marginalized. They don't have a place that they're really fitting in the community, in their life. So you have that struggle on the left, and then you look at the right. You have somebody that comes in with a promise of acceptance in a relationship, promise of home, shelter, promise of income, wealth and getting rich quick, and that promise of acceptance, which I think is really important, right? That's what everybody really wants in life, is a place to be accepted. Traffickers are really good at kind of manipulating that piece. So if you look at how those two kind of come together in the middle, it's not a shock that unfortunately, that event can take place over time.
So regarding runaways, one of the things we do from a proactive approach within our human trafficking task force, we have other members within that group that meet on a monthly basis. I call it the runaway group because we know that kids that run away oftentimes fall in human trafficking, especially if it's a number of times within a short time span, because they feel like they have no other options. They're usually running away from something, and so they run into the arms of a trafficker, if you will. So within our group, we utilize, through our patrol officers, a checklist of a number of different questions. Has the runaway traveled out of the States without permission? Has the runaway have tattoos? Do they have new possessions that they could not afford themselves? Do they have sexually transmitted diseases? All these different things add up to a number that would suggest they're either at risk for being trafficked or at high risk. And so once they have that label, if you will, we monitor them along with social services, child protective services, to try to get those runaways and kids the resources that they need to hopefully stay away from trafficking.
And a lot of it is building relationships with those kids, right? Because they may need help more than anybody else in our community. So if they recognize the people on the task force as friendly faces that they can turn to when they're on troubled times, that's a really important thing. I think that's one of those pieces that sets us apart from other communities, is this team that meets together and recognizes, okay, who are the kids that we're interacting with that are running away from home the most, that are having the most trouble. Those are the kids we need to be paying attention to. So I think that's a nice piece that we're providing the public.
So this slide talks about identifying victims, or why victims don't identify themselves as victims. I mentioned earlier as well the shame and guilt that comes with being trafficked. A lot of these situations, as we'll talk more about social media, kids will send out nude photos of themselves. I mean, we deal with this all the time. And these photos end up spiraling out of control because now whoever's on the other end asks for additional photos. Oh, if you don't do this, it's a blackmail situation. Then I'm going to go to your friends and family and show them these photos. Now you need to have sex with me, or now you need to have sex with my friend. And then they end up being trafficked eventually. It's just one of those vicious cycles that can occur.
And we talked a lot about self-identification, and this kind of showcases some of that shame or guilt or fear that somebody isn't going to understand, those misconceptions about victims, fear of arrest or prosecution, or in some cases, deportation if there's an immigration issue where they're concerned about their interaction with law enforcement being what might end up having them deported from our country. The retaliation piece, we see that often, all those different abuse pieces that can kind of take place. And a lot of girls or guys get stuck it's a lack of transportation or controlled movement. They might depend upon this place for shelter. It's just a really difficult place that unfortunately victims find themselves.
One of the things we haven't covered much, but there is this difference between labor trafficking and sex trafficking, right? And we oftentimes in our presentations refer to the sex trafficking because that's what we most oftentimes deal with. But don't think for a moment, especially in America's dairyland, that there isn't a possibility through agricultural means to have labor trafficking on our farms. People come from, across the border, probably sent to some of our local farms. They're somewhat isolated because usually the housing is right on the farm and all the means for transportation is at the farm, and there's this control element, and there's this debt that needs to be paid, and oftentimes they're never quite able to pay that debt because now they have this housing that they get and food, and they can never get quite ahead to get out of the labor trafficking.
So when we talk about recruitment, I like to point out that you can really access any piece of information in the world or contact anybody with one of these things. And we just hand them to 12-year-olds and just expect everything's going to be okay. And unfortunately, a lot of parents just kind of want to trust that their kids are going to make good decisions. And I respect that as a parent. But unfortunately, as kids are growing, they make mistakes. And they might be over-trusting, thinking that because I'm in my bedroom with a phone, that this person that I'm interacting with isn't going to be able to connect with me. And like Scott talked about earlier, kids sharing inappropriate photographs or videos, we deal with it on a weekly basis, and we have to provide a lot of education to parents and kids both to try to, curb some of that behavior. Like I talked about earlier at a middle school today, where every kid that I interacted with, 600 of them, they all have access to social media and they're all interacting with people online. Thankfully, they were honest that they don't know. So I think that's a huge impact that it's having on society. And it's going to take us some time to figure out what we're doing with it. To parents that are either here or online, there are some great apps that you can use to restrict the access that your kids, so for instance, at our home we use Google Family Link. My teenager absolutely hates it, which tells me it's a very effective app. So a lot of times when we have parents that are having a kid, they may be interacting with people online. There's some concerns where maybe trafficking isn't an issue, but they might be heading in that direction. We try to help parents understand that there are apps, there are ways to control the information that your kids have online, what apps they can have on their phones, because unfortunately an app like Snapchat is kind of designed for this purpose, right? It goes away, it disappears. A lot of these places don't like to have an impact and interact with law enforcement. So like in the slide here, you can see a couple of examples, and we have a difficult time even keeping up with the amount of apps that are being used. And then cases that I have, I'm Googling a different app probably a couple times a month that come up. So like Snapchat, sex trafficked on social media, the children sold on Snapchat and Instagram. If it can be used for good purposes, unfortunately it can also be used for bad purposes. We see this often in the TikTok example where someone's pretending to be a young person, pretending to be somebody to build trust with younger kids, and they end up being an adult. And unfortunately, kids just assume that if the profile picture looks like somebody that's their age, they're going to have a conversation with them, they're going to become virtual friends, and unfortunately, bad things can happen from that. Tinder, it's an app that's a little unconventional and kind of used for dating that obviously can be used to recruit sex trafficking victims. One of the bigger issues that you see here is the Bumble. The dating app refuses to give details on a sex predator. A lot of these apps have servers overseas in countries that do not have reciprocity with the United States. So some of them don't recognize U.S. legal service. So if we try to subpoena information about a subscriber or a user, a lot of times we're not getting a lot of cooperation, or we're only getting minimal information on our legal service. That makes it really difficult for us to identify people, IP addresses, other things like that. So that's really difficult. Roblox is one that I like to talk about often because it's a gaming app. And, road trips are long for parents. Here, play a game on this 4-hour car ride, not realizing that Roblox actually has a chat feature built into it. And you can talk to other people in the app. That's a big concern for me. So just knowing these things, educate yourself as a parent. If you interact with young people very often, we got to have conversations about this because, unfortunately, technology can be used for good, but Scott and I often see it used for bad purposes.
So how can we help? Just having an awareness of human trafficking, you guys being here tonight, I think is helpful for our community, right? The more eyes we have on the streets and the roads to possibly recognize something that's not quite right. If you see something, say something, right? Human trafficking is oftentimes the crime that's in plain sight. Law enforcement's struggled. We've had difficulty identifying it ourselves. It's just one of those things that even our patrol officers and even Brendan and I have probably been in front of victims and not knowing it at the time. It's just one of those things we keep trying to get better and better. But if you recognize somebody that's changing, maybe it's somebody you know, maybe it's a family member where they're starting to change their way of dress, they're starting to get possessions that they couldn't normally afford themselves.
Detaching.
Detaching from you, trying to hide things from you. Cell phones that you didn't approve of and know of. Longer eyelashes, nails. All this stuff is very expensive, and it's coming from somewhere. So it should at least pique your interest and make you ask some questions.
One thing that I think is really important is being a responsible citizen. So not, sharing information that you really haven't vetted. I have a pretty large presence on social media. I try to interact with the public, and I get inundated with a lot of information that if you would just do a little research on the story or what you're hearing, you could be able to prove it's probably not accurate. So I appreciate people willing to bring that forward. But the rumor mill that gets spread around, kids being kidnapped off the street and, the white van that's going to Quick Trips and picking people up, there are a lot of misconceptions about trafficking and about what takes place in our community. So just kind of be mindful if you see it on Facebook, before you hit that share button, just take a second, maybe do a little research or ask yourself if this is legitimate, because that does cause us a little bit of headache because you have all these people reporting this information that clearly isn't accurate. Well, that takes away from the investigative efforts that we're making because we're trying to verify whether that information is true or not. So it's something to just be concerned of. But again, if there's something where it doesn't feel right, side on the air of caution and just report it to law enforcement or do a Crime Stoppers tip if you're concerned about your identity being compromised. So I think that's just a really important thing that if it doesn't look right, doesn't feel right, chances are there's probably something off, and leave it up to kind of investigate and vet what's going on with it. And then obviously supporting local advocacy groups is huge. So we work with a lot of nonprofits, Safe Harbor, Raise, the Lakeshore CAC, and our task force. So whatever you could do to support us, whether it's just following us on social media or having conversations with people that you had this presentation that you attended and you enjoyed yourself. I'm not telling you what to think about it, but I think that's a really important thing too, that the community helps support kind of the boots on the ground that are working with victims. You had a question?
What is CAC?
So that is the Child Advocacy Center. So it's based out of Saukville. We use that to interview children who are either victims of crime or witnesses of crimes. They have forensic interviewers that are specially trained on how to interview children. They're actually in some very early fundraising efforts now to actually get a satellite station opened here in Sheboygan. Right now they actually operate out of the police department, which is good for us because we have easy access to a really high quality forensic interviewer, but it's not the most ideal situation. So they're definitely trying to make sure that they have a local resource here to both serve victims and witnesses of crimes who are children. Scott and I use it all the time.
All the time. Did we cover Raise?
Raise, yeah.
Runaway Youth Services? Not only are they part of our human trafficking task force, but we refer our juvenile runaways and their families to Runaway Youth Services so that they can get those resources that they need. It's a huge benefit to us. And even if we have somebody that's not a runaway, but we see a child that might be headed down a bad path, we can do referrals and they'll reach out to the family and see what they can do to help out.
What's great is they have a federal grant right now, so they actually get to work with people who are up to 21. So that kind of gap between, like, when someone turns 18, there might be, kind of less eyes paying attention. Raise can kind of fill that gap and kind of help us with that. So I think that's a really important piece for us. And then the resources and reporting, there's a national hotline that is available 24/7. And again, your local police department, the sheriff's department, and then Raise, Mobile Crisis, Safe Harbor, and Crime Stoppers are kind of more the main resources and reporting avenues that we have in Sheboygan. So probably the eager part of the presentation, who has questions? And I'm certainly willing to answer any of them. Go right ahead.
Can you have these folks
putting you on the spot for asking a question. I'm glad you told everybody that after some hands went up.
My question is there like a common tattoo or like a brand that you see often with the victims or traffickers?
We don't see a typical brand or tattoo. It does happen from time to time. I will tell you, most of the cases that I've been involved in, I haven't yet observed that.
There has been, photos that we've seen online. You can probably pull them up yourself. It'll be the trafficker's name, property of, those types of things. Cash, money, those are the main things. Because keep in mind, some of these victims are very much a believer that this is the road to the riches. If not by being trafficked themselves, they feel like, believe it or not, they can be a trafficker one day, or they can be a drug dealer, and they can have their own stable of girls or boys that they can traffic themselves and take advantage of.
And I suppose they don't want to be marked with like, oh, I recognize that person. He's got this cross tattoo on the shoulder.
You'd be surprised though,
you know.
because unfortunately, in aspects of society, this lifestyle has been kind of glamorized.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it does become kind of appealing to somebody, especially if they're on hard times. So some people are fairly brazen and proud of the lifestyle that they're in, and sometimes people are ashamed. It's really just situation dependent. But it's not like every victim we've ever encountered with has some specific brand or mark, but it is something that you see that's just different than other criminal activity that we investigate.
Oftentimes, the question is, what do they have to go home to? If being with the trafficker somehow feels better, or this promise of a better future,
Yeah.
they'll opt to do that.
Yikes. Thank you.
Keep in mind, there's trauma that's often taking place at home. It could be a sexual abuse situation, and that's what they're running from.
Who are the individuals, or how can we determine or have any insight into, they're being solicited by someone. Someone is looking for individuals to pay for sex. And I have maybe a better likelihood that we're rubbing elbows with those people more likely than we're rubbing elbows with people who are being prostituted. Who are these individuals, and how do we make it known in Sheboygan that you're not gonna solicit sex here? Or you can't necessarily do that, but I just have a feeling that those are the people we may interact with more than those who are the actual victims.
Yeah, that's a great point, and Scott actually brought this up at a recent interview that we did for a news station, is that obviously this has gone on for years and years and years, the prostitution and solicitation. It's not a new thing. So that demand aspect, absolutely, that continues to drive this moving forward. We have done demand suppression operations in Sheboygan a couple times in the past couple years, and you're finding people from really every walk of life. They might be truck drivers, they might be somebody that, if they have a job, they might be married, they might have kids, and maybe there's some intimacy issues in the relationship. It's a variety of people. We obviously can't get into the details of who those people are, but generally they're kind of regular people. Some of them, know this from the drug community. They might be involved with drug use, and that those lifestyles kind of interact sometimes. But yeah, I would agree with you 100% that there needs to be obviously a message conveyed that the demand aspect needs to be dealt with. Go ahead.
I'm assuming a lot of the victims would want to come and have counseling or therapy. Like, are there certain agencies or places that are more apt to provide those kind of services?
Yes, so we use Safe Harbor as an advocate for the victims here locally. RAISE is, the agency that we use for the youth services, and up to 21 now, which is great because social services cuts off at age 18.
Right.
So
I will say that in our community, there is a gap. There is a gap on, really effective like inpatient treatment. Because if you look at all the different needs that a victim might have, they might need AODA issues, they might need mental health, and then there's obviously just the trauma from the victimization. There's all these different things. I'm fortunate that I'm building relationships with people all over the country. So I'm working with a group in Green Bay. There's a young lady who was a victim that I worked with. She's actually at a facility in Florida. A lot of this is like finding somebody who can link you up with the right resource, and then
Right.
obviously find the funding, because there's a gap there with some of these places come with a cost. So
Right.
it's difficult, but we have a group of people that are really committed on serving victims and helping them. So a lot of it is just kind of troubleshooting on, developing relationships with people that can help. And I
Sure.
think we have a ways to go in that regard.
Okay.
But thankfully, the victims that we have interacted with, really for some of my cases recently, we've had success in finding them treatment. Unfortunately, we don't know how successful we're going to be,
Right.
long-term, but it's definitely worth trying to get them linked up with the right resources.
Okay. Like, what is the task force itself? Like, what kind of things do you, like the task force, what do you guys do then?
So we meet monthly and talk about a variety of different issues. So the task force has been in existence since 2008. So we've been around for a while, and then like everything else in society, COVID kind of tipped everything upside down and what kind of impact we were having. So we kind of reevaluated who's a part of the task force, and we're really more of a multidisciplinary team where all the different stakeholders are committed to meeting every month, and obviously contributing to what the needs are. So we've talked about, we've done a community awareness video. So we tried to have our production crew come in and help us, and they found out that we didn't have much money, so we did it with my smartphone. And we posted that on Facebook, and that was our big push because we weren't using social media effectively on getting accurate information out to the community. So we really started ramping that up in January. We've had a huge success in being able to engage with the public and get relevant information out there. Our community awareness video, I think, was helpful in just getting relevant information and just getting people talking about this issue. And that's really kind of how we ended up here today, is kind of pushing this out and having people interested in getting together and having a conversation about this. There's all sorts of different things that we're talking about. There's some legislation that we're in the very early stages of discussing. There's all sorts of different projects. We're working actually with a news crew in Green Bay who's going to be doing a story on the work that we're doing that hopefully will be going this summer. So we're also planning on what we can just do to provide a better service to victims. So we've been interacting with Survivor of Trafficking, who's been attending our meetings virtually, just so we're making sure that we're kind of understanding that thought process. So there's a lot of different kind of irons in the fire right now with all the different things that we're trying to accomplish. Any other questions, here or virtually?
Virtually.
Go ahead.
Where are these individuals coming from? When you see them in Sheboygan, are they outside of Sheboygan percentage-wise? And I know that's difficult to see, and it changes year to year. But are these people being trafficked out of our city, or a lot of times the individuals you're finding and booking, are they coming from other areas? I know it's probably a mixture, but also, what is the repercussion for an individual who, because I don't know, obviously none of us, I don't know, I don't want to assume, but what's the repercussion for an individual who is caught soliciting sex? And what it, is it if the individual is under 18 or if the individual is over 18? Not the victim, but what happens to the individual who is seeking these things? So I know that's a few different questions,
That's all
but
right.
it's stat related.
We'll do the first one. So the first thing I'll tell you is this is probably the most underreported crime in our community. So it's hard for us to really know, full circle exactly what's going on. I will tell you that we're an hour away from Milwaukee, and we're 2 hours away from Chicago, which we forget is the third biggest city in America. So the metropolitan aspect does have an impact. We do see trafficking that takes place within Sheboygan County. We do see recruitment that takes place here, and then the actual trafficking takes place in Milwaukee. So it kind of depends on really the trafficker and what type of network they have. We've observed it happen in local hotels, houses, just simply meeting up in vehicles. It really is kind of case dependent. It's not like there's like this one place with a sign that says human trafficking. I wish it was that easy for us. But a lot of it is just building relationships with people in the community, getting really timely intelligence about where things are happening, and just being proactive investigatively to figure out what we can do. If we can't arrest somebody, at least providing the resources to the people we believe to be victims to try to curb the behavior from continuing. You want to get the second part?
Well, I can, but just to add to that, the traffickers don't have a lot of overhead, right? They have a device, they have a hotel room possibly, and they have their stable of girls or boys, and they can travel, with a vehicle. So when we do our demand suppression, which is, you talked earlier about how do we deal with the demand? Well, our demand suppression looks at that, and we take out one component of the three spokes, right? But we've had survivor recovery operations where we're trying to get victims off the road as well, or off the streets. Trying to build a case that way, it can be difficult because now you're trying to get a victim in, break down these barriers, try to get them interviewed and corroborate, get corroborating information outside of just their testimony. So, hotel receipts and surveillance video from hotels, those types of things to show and show a path of where they've been and what they've been doing. So, as far as, what do they end up? Well, it all depends on the case. Is it a good enough case to get to court and get through the courts? And if it does, it's been very successful. Brandon just mentioned before the presentation, somebody got multiple decades, right, as a trafficker. So, and that's a credit to Brandon and everybody involved in that case. So it all depends.
There is a difference though in penalty if you're soliciting an adult or a child. So it's a Class A misdemeanor if you're soliciting someone who's over 18. If they're under 18, then it's a felony. So it does change things. It is different depending upon who you're soliciting. So age definitely matters on what type of penalty there is for somebody who is soliciting, and that's not something that we hesitate to work on. So without getting into too many details, I'm working on a case right now that's pretty extensive. One component of that is identifying all of the people who have met with these victims and sitting them down for an interview. Tell me about how you found the ad, when you met with this person, how many times have you met with this person, and you'd be surprised to actually tell you the truth. I haven't had anybody lie about it. They're kind of caught red-handed when the detective says, hey, I want to talk to you about this young lady that you met 6 months ago. They kind of know that the gig is up. So, but part of that piece is them getting arrested for solicitation. So that's a big part of the whole encompassing of that case. That's not something that we ignore at all because we recognize that, when you impact the demand, it lessens the continuation of this crime in our community. Anybody else? Or in virtual land? Was this helpful? Did it change your minds a little bit about maybe what you thought kind of coming in here, or maybe some thoughts you had about what trafficking is? Did it kind of give you some new pieces of information?
Without revealing, obviously, things, what are some examples, maybe in the past that you've seen where you're saying if you say something, or see something, say something, pardon me. Well, what are examples that you said you've seen things in front of you? What are a few things in Sheboygan, maybe a few of the typical ruse in Sheboygan that we may see, we're not even realizing what we're seeing?
We've had a couple cases. We have had people come in the summertime and go down to the lakefront and disguise themselves as a movie producer or rat video, a video producer or something like that. We can't say for certain that their intentions were to be trafficking, but that's certainly a concerning thing that they're going up to these random people at the park and promising them money for pictures and photographs. I mean, that's kind of one of those gateway things where it's like, okay, we need to be paying attention to that. So we have had that happen here. I mean, really most of what we're seeing, both at the adult and child level, is there's this just dark underworld that really exists in Sheboygan where, really drug addiction, I think, just plays a huge impact on how this is happening. So if you think of a house where it's a safe haven for people to go there and distribute drugs or use drugs or hide from the police, it's not a stretch of the imagination that also can be used to facilitate sex trafficking as well. So, that's kind of an example of something that we're seeing. Everyone knows this house on the block is kind of a troublesome house. That can be an impediment for us investigatively, but by putting pressure and knocking on the door and making contact there and talking to neighbors and trying to put together an investigation, it might not always be successful, but those are some of the steps that we take to try to, at least get some momentum in investigating what's going on.
Another example would be, let's say you're at a gas station, a truck stop, and you see people arguing, and maybe the individual is not dressed appropriately, and they just don't seem to fit. One's quite a bit older, and they don't seem like they're a couple. You know, if your instincts are telling you this isn't right, definitely give us a call. Don't put yourselves in harm's way. If you can get a license plate number and forward that to us, maybe last direction of travel, maybe what they're addressed as, you know, those types of things, so we can try to identify, and we'll look into it. We'll figure out as best we can to see if there's a crime taking place.
That's a really good point, though. I've had a couple cases where I've kind of gone back in history to see like what type of contact they've had with law enforcement, and they have had contact with like 2 patrol officers because a neighbor reported that they were arguing. And at that time, we just haven't put the pieces together that there's a trafficking relationship there. But I mean, that can be a huge piece for us investigatively, especially if this goes through court, that there's this incident that we know for a fact happened, we can corroborate it, that there was an argument, that a neighbor may have witnessed some things. That's a really good point, because we do see that often.
I mean, we all are aware that big sporting events, you know, bring in trafficking. Then we just had a Ryder Cup here.
Well, we did do what I refer to as a sting operation for the Ryder Cup. If you can imagine our workforce is limited when the week starts up, but we had one at the beginning of the week when things were a little calmer, and it was successful. You know, they oftentimes refer to it as the Super Bowl, as this huge human trafficking event, and it is, but you have to have a lot of law enforcement and advocates and other groups to support the sting operation. It can be 30 people just to make a go of it and do it right. So, and it's successful every time we do it.
Yeah, we partner with the Department of Justice, their Division of Criminal Investigation. They provide a lot of resources, special agents and analysts to kind of organize that, because it is very manpower intensive. You know, we did have some arrests from that situation, and I can't really attribute any of them to the Ryder Cup. Some of them actually traveled pretty far. We had a couple people actually travel from like the Fond du Lac area.
At least they wouldn't admit that was part of the
Yeah,
Ryder Cup.
yeah, so.
It's hard to say.
But I think just the awareness piece of like being very loud and public about it, that we have this big event, the Ryder Cup coming, and you know, we're going to be proactive with disrupting the impact this is having. We're not going to let, you know, this great thing for our community contribute to, you know, some of these activities from taking place.
Okay. So I know it can happen like anywhere at any time, but have you guys had any issues at North Point?
I haven't
Like
had.
that parking, like you can stop and look at the
Yep.
lake. There's a lot of parking, you know, like at night. You know what I mean? Like when I was in high school, like you're like, oh, don't ever go to North Point with a guy. You know what I mean? Like, is there any, like, have you had any issues over there?
No, I mean, I started my career in 2005, and people have been parking there overnight doing whatever. You know,
So you haven't had like any like specific situations?
not related to sex trafficking. I mean, we may have had some sexual assault investigations that have come from there. You know, that were maybe people were known or not known, but nothing regarding trafficking. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's a place that I would go park at night and not be concerned.
I parked there and watched the lake
Yeah.
too, but I was just like thinking back to like high school, or like you're parking next to a car and you're like, oh, they're doing something over there. You know what I mean? So it's just like,
Yeah,
I know. It has been a year on thing, but I just never knew, like, thinking about, like, destinations of, like, actually thinking about sex trafficking, like, oh.
Yeah, I can't say there's really anywhere in our community where I would say it's unsafe to be. I mean, there are obviously places where, you know, maybe there's a certain group of people that, you know, are involved in criminal activity they might associate with, but I wouldn't be overly concerned to park there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I still park there, but I was just wondering, like, throughout the years, like, if you haven't had any, like, oh.
Thankfully not.
Yeah.
Is it seasonal?
Oh, for sure.
Is it what?
Is it seasonal? You mentioned summer coming up.
I wouldn't say it's seasonal. I mean,
I've never made that connection.
It certainly doesn't discriminate, I don't think, upon weather, so it's not like us in yard work. You know, we're not going outside in February to do gardening. Human trafficking.
With more people outdoors, you know, because summer coming.
No, I don't know that really impacts things, you know, I mean, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of, like, you keep using the term sting, is that something that either all these things, but I think it would only make sense that you would.
Here's what I'll tell you. I spend a lot of time in dark corners of the internet, kind of procuring what, is taking place kind of in our community that is online. Luckily, Scott and I have some really, really good investigative resources that are exclusive to law enforcement that allow us to get timely intelligence about things that are posted online. So, there's tons of different ads that facilitate this where, kind of like Craigslist had the personal ads back in the day. So that's kind of what started this whole thing. And it's morphed in all these different, these websites. But thankfully, there's a website where we can kind of organize a lot of those escort ads, and you can search by location. And that really helps Scott and I kind of figure out, okay, what's going on. And we can look at phone numbers and email addresses and
Facial recognition. It allows you
facial
to
recognition.
identify somebody's face on the ad and pull up additional ads from different areas.
So when we have a missing child, I'll take a photograph of that child, upload it on this website, and it'll look, if there's any ads matching that. So there are some really good resources for us. I spend tons of time doing that, just because that's how you're learning, because this really is happening online. That's kind of the main presence where this is taking place. So we just have to be aggressive and proactive about what we're learning about is being posted online. And thankfully, there's just a lot of good companies that have come together in the technological community and made our lives a lot easier, because otherwise we'd be inundated with trying to organize this information and going to all these different websites. And some of these websites you actually have to have an account, and they make it very difficult for law enforcement to make an account. So that is another hurdle for us. Thankfully, some of these resources that we have for online investigations, that's not an issue for us. So,
Good question.
yeah, very good question.
Do you pattern your programs after areas or communities that do well in trafficking as far as resolving problems and issues and things? Rather than reinventing the wheel and figuring
Right.
out something, are there certain places that you really want?
I would say that the training that we receive is patterned after different areas. Dallas is very much at the forefront of human trafficking. They've done a lot of research and a lot of sting operations. Rebecca Bender is a survivor, somebody you may want to look into. She's got books out there. In the Pursuit of Love is one of the books, I believe. And she talks about, the time she was involved in trafficking, and now she's an advocate that does trainings. I've done trainings. I believe Brandon's done trainings with her as well. And that's how we were able to connect with a survivor for our task force as well, as through Rebecca Bender's program. So it's been really good that way. Did I answer your question?
I was just wondering if there's certain areas that do, that are, they had this issue and they're.
I will tell you that there actually are a lot of communities in the state that are reaching out to us because they're kind of hearing that we're having some momentum. And a lot of it is, our increased social media presence kind of probably has people talking a little bit, and it's like, okay, what are you guys doing? So we've shared documents with a lot of adjacent counties and other parts of the state where they've reached out and, what are you guys doing? What does your multidisciplinary team look like? Because some other communities are maybe a little bit behind, or they're trying to organize things. The interesting thing is a lot of communities think that you need deep pockets in order to do this. We're doing this with nothing. This is just a part of our job duties, where you have all these committed people who have agreed to meet together once a month and prioritize this issue and accompany to their regular jobs. Scott obviously has other cases, so do I, but this is another part of our role. So you don't need, this huge budget or tons of grants to actually have an impact, because we're doing it, and we're not getting, any huge donations or anything like that. We're doing a lot of this kind of very grassroots, so it can kind of go to show you that you don't need, $500,000 in federal grants to be effective. I think a lot of it is the relationships that you build in the community, and then having a great group of professionals organize and prioritizing this. We're just lucky we have that in Sheboygan. I don't know that other communities don't, but when Scott and I pick up the phone to an advocate or somebody on our task force, we're dropping what we're doing because we're prioritizing that this is a really important issue. So that's one thing I think we're really fortunate for.
I would add that Sheboygan County's been very good in supporting our task force, whether it be the sheriff's office or the police department, to have administrations that are open to the idea that trafficking's a problem and that we need to commit resources to it. So it's been a huge benefit for us.
I would add our district attorney's office as well.
Yes.
District Attorney Joel Ormansky is very, very at the forefront of being aggressive with prosecutions for trafficking and also helping victims restore their lives. Scott and I had the pleasure of working with him very often in our cases, and he ends up being the lead prosecutor on pretty much all of them. So we're fortunate that we have that piece as well, too, that when this becomes a legal issue in court, that we're having probably one of the best prosecutors in the state working on that and getting justice for that victim. Any other questions? There's an email address on here on the screen. If you're a part of a group that would like a presentation like this, the best way to do it is actually emailing this. We have a training coordinator. We get inundated with requests, so it's better to just have kind of one person organizing that. So that ends up being a good option. So we're doing these presentations, it seems like, probably everybody in our task force kind of take turns doing them, probably doing 4 or 5 a month, it seems like. So.
Right.
So it's shebcohtttf@gmail.com. So shebcohtttf@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope it was beneficial. Thank you for braving the monsoon outside to come spend the evening with us. So we really appreciate it. All right, thank you.
Good. How are you?
Another one down.
Thank you, everyone.